Well, welcome back to second part of our program on drugs and altered states of consciousness. And drugs and these altered states of consciousness have often been linked to creativity. I'm sure you've all heard of the musicians and the painters and a lot of writers who have used drugs, and their argument has been that somehow it expands their understanding and gives them insights. Well, I was going to tell you about a scientific experiment, and this is just one. These were fairly typical in the 1960s. And this is an interesting one because it didn't study artists or creative people per se, but it did study creativity in people like, engineers or physicists. So here was the setup. And this was before LSD was made illegal in the early 1960s, by the way. So they invited 27 participants, people who were professionals in their field, to come into a room, and then they were given LSD and told to work on some problem that they had, at work. And so, and they would just work on these problems. And then the experiment was to see how far they got on them and whether there was any new insights, things like that. Okay, so there were 27 participants, and in total they worked on 44 different problems. And I'll just read out the results here. So of the 44 problems that they worked on while they were on LSD, one problem, it sort of died at the end of the experiment, so they didn't get very far on it. 20 of the problems, however, there were new methods of explorations. In other words, the participants found new ways of studying the problem. One of the problems, they actually developed an entire model to explain it. 6 of the problems were completely solved, and 10 of the problems were partially solved. And 4 of the problems had no solution at all. But if you think about that, I mean, that's a pretty impressive result from a single experiment. And these sorts of experiments were conducted more than once, many times, and with more or less the same results. And then they asked the participants, well, what did this LSD do for you? And they made these arguments that, for example, they could see the problem in a new light. So rather than the typical way of studying something, somehow they could alter their perception of it and see this in a new way. Or maybe another example was that they would say they would take things that appeared to be conflicting, ideas that were conflicting or behaviors that were conflicting, and somehow they were able to put them together in meaningful ways. Or they might be able to visualize the end of the end of the solution, this bigger solution that would encompass all aspects of the problem. So the basic idea was that somehow through this altered state of consciousness, that they could actually perceive the problem differently, which is actually well known to be a key to creativity. So just one example of a drug-induced altered state that perhaps maybe it has something to do with being a little more creative. And we know this from talking, for example, with our clients, that they will routinely tell us that they feel more creative, or that things become interesting, or they become more absorbed in their work, or they understand it in a different light. All these sorts of ideas. Anyway, that's this episode on our online program, and we'll be back next time with another one on drugs and altered states.